Hello everyone, Assalamualaikum, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Good afternoon to everyone who has signed in today. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. I'm Umu from Pusat Dokumentasi Arsitektur, and it is my pleasure to be the host for today's Obrolan Heritage. So Obrolan Heritage is a monthly talk hosted by Pusat Dokumentasi Arsitektur in a collaboration with Indonesian Institute of Architects and facilitated by Trisakti University. So to begin this heritage talk, Obrolan Heritage, we are pleased to have Pak Punto Pak Punto Wijayanto from Faculty of Civil Engineering and Planning, Trisakti University, to deliver the opening remarks. Pak Punto, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kak Umu. Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon to all participants. We have now 61, but I'm sure more will come. So welcome to the Obrolan Heritage ke-55, 55, and we are happy because almost, pretty sure, every month we organize this Obrolan Heritage. National or international expert share their story, share their experience in this Obrolan Heritage. Join the event projects or collaboration between PDA, Trisakti, and Ikatan Arsitek Indonesia. And today, our topic is about adaptive reuse, and we are very lucky because we have an expert, our colleague from Hong Kong, Hugo. Hello, Hugo.
Hi.
Yes, he is currently teaching at the Hong Kong U, Division of Architectural Conservation Programs. And recently, Hugo just published a book, one of the writers, about Asian revitalization adaptive reuse in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Singapore. I think Hugo also will talk more about his book, and he will present his experience or perhaps research about adaptive reuse topics, especially about Shanghai. So enjoy the talk. Thank you, Kak Umu. Thank you, Hugo.
Thank you, Punto.
Thank you, Pak Punto Wijayanto, for delivering the wonderful remarks. So before we get started, allow me to take a few moments to go over a few important technical details. First, we only provide nilai kum to EIE members, so we do not provide either physical or digital certificate. Then there will be no attendance form, as we already use the automatic attendance report from Zoom. So please, if you haven't done so, use the same full name from the registration form. And then during the presentation, please disable your audio. And the rest of the details of the rules can be reviewed from the emails we sent already. And then we're also gonna attach the rules here in the chat room as well, so you can go over them easily. So in today's session, in the next 2 hours or so, we'll feature the subject of urban revitalization through adaptive reuse in Shanghai. So allow me to introduce today's speaker, Hugo Chan. Wait. I will share the screen. Please bear with me. Okay. So Dr. Hugo Chan from Division of Architectural Conservation Program, Faculty of Architecture, the University of Hong Kong. He holds degrees in architecture, business administration, urban planning, and built heritage conservation. And he is one of the few Hong Kong and mainland China-based professional practitioners with well-rounded expertise in the key discipline of the built environment field. A registered town planner with extensive private practice experience in architectural, conservation, and urban planning projects in Shanghai and Beijing. He was appointed a key consultant for the Yangon Heritage Trust and the Princess Foundation, and co-authored the Conservation Master Plan for the city of Yangon, entitled Yangon Heritage Strategy, Combining Conservation and Development to Create Asia's Most Livable City, published in 2016. Also, I would like to introduce our moderator, Mbak Devina from IAI. So I will pass the baton to Mbak Devina to lead today's Obrolan Heritage. Mbak Devina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Umu. Thank you, everybody. Nice to having you here today with us for this 55th Obrolan Heritage. Today, we're going to be discussing about a more and more popular topic on adaptive reuse. It has now becoming more significantly discussed as there are many projects are going towards that direction. And as Punto has indicated that we are fortunate to have Dr. Hugo Chan today with us. He himself is very familiar with Jakarta. He has been here in Jakarta. And not only that, I think I'm being very humbled by the fact that he's been walking in Jakarta in many hours on foot just to get to know the city better, embracing the ambience, getting to know the city by heart, right? As you walk by, then you do not want to be too fast and not to picking up the necessary details as you try to embrace the history of the city and stuff like that. So he's really taken Jakarta wholeheartedly. And he's been to any other cities as well. My knowledge is only Yogyakarta in Central Java. So you get to know Jakarta and other Indonesian cities that's quite very different. But I think what we have shared in common is that we have the needs of embracing adaptive reuse. It's much more a proper way, in a sense, that is sustaining the urban fabrics, sustaining the city history, stuff like that, for the value of the future. And so without further ado, I think I will pass the time now for you. So just for your information, what Mbak Umu just mentioned, that we provide some CPD, so certified professional CPD points for those professional architects or any other who can benefit from this lecture. Then we are taking credits from attending your lecture, as we find that is resourceful. So without further ado, then the floor is yours, Hugo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Davina, and also Punto and Umu. It is an honor for me to talk here in front of this professional body today. First, let me share screen and show you.
As you're preparing the screen, how would you like the sessions to be hosted? Like, do you allow questions come in the middle of the presentations, or you would like to take everything to the end?
I think if that, I may have like question during the presentation, and I would like you to respond through chat box. So you might type in short answer. And other than that, I think we will have a discussion session at the end, right? So maybe we'll leave a question at the end. Okay. If there's something that you would really like to say, you would like to raise during the presentation, please feel free to type in the chat box. I think I'll look at it.
Yes, and if there's any raised hands or anything, Would that be possible, Hugo, to have a burning questions, for example? Or you would rather skip it to the
I'm not sure if I can see, because I can only see
okay. I can see it, but I can indicate to you if there's anybody raising hands. Okay.
Yes.
Awesome.
Okay, great. So again, thank you very much for inviting me, Tapina. You didn't mention we've been friends for like decades, right? We actually studied urban planning together back in Hong Kong U when Tapina was a scholarship holder. And we spent 2 years together in Hong Kong at Hong Kong U, studying Master of Urban Planning. And after that, I left Hong Kong and I started to work in Shanghai. And actually for almost 10 years, because I worked for an architectural firm, American architectural firm in Shanghai. And then for the first few years, I stationed in Shanghai. And after that, I was relocated to Beijing and Guangzhou for a few years, but still I need to go back to Shanghai so often to my office. So for almost 10 years, I was on and off living and working in Shanghai. And then about 10 years ago, I quit my job and I moved back to Hong Kong to pursue a PhD at Hong Kong U. And then during my PhD, my research focus was actually on Shanghai as well. I studied Shikumen architecture, which I will talk a little bit about later on. So this is kind of a traditional residential typology that was very popular in Shanghai in the old days. So for 5 years, I was also commuting between Shanghai and Hong Kong to conduct my research. And after that, I worked in Yangon for 1 year. And after that, I moved back to Hong Kong and started teaching at this architectural conservation program division. And during when I worked with my colleagues in this division and to co-author the book that Davina mentioned earlier, and also Punto also mentioned. So this is Asian Revitalization, Adaptive Reuse in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Singapore. And I was privileged enough to be involved mostly in the Shanghai portion. So I was like 1/3 of the author of this book. And if you're interested, I believe Davina has a copy of this book. So I think she would be happy to share this book with any of you. And again, I would like to thank Davina and also Ria as well. She mentioned I was in Jakarta walking for hours. But I also need to thank Davina and Ria for inviting me and also taking me around to see the old town of Jakarta, which was fascinating. And I am really looking forward to my next trip to Jakarta again and catch up with you guys, and also Punto as well. Last time I saw Punto was in Hong Kong at this HIA workshop at Hong Kong U. And I have yet to meet Punto in Jakarta. And I really look forward to this reunion trip in Jakarta later when the world is back to normal. Okay, so today I prepared actually a two-part presentation. So the first part is about the history or the historical development and the evolution of the Shanghai city center through the concession period and then the post-Republican Chinese period and all the way to today. And then I would also touch upon a number of important or milestone adaptive reuse projects in Shanghai. And then the second part, I have selected two case studies actually from this book as well, because in this book, I actually wrote a timeline and then also talked about the history and the evolution of the adaptive reuse projects in Shanghai. And then we also have selected 5 case studies, and it was detailed in this book. But then for this presentation, I have selected 2, but I also think it may take quite a long time. So I'm not sure whether I can go through the 2 projects, the 2 detailed projects in as much details as I would like. But in any case, I'm going to share my presentation files with the thinner later on, and I think you can post it somewhere so that everyone who's interested may download the file and look at the 2 projects in more detail. And
Thank you, Hugo.
So, okay, first, when we talk about adaptive reuse, so as Katina mentioned, it has become more and more popular, especially in cities with a long history. And because of the change or the modernization of city and our living and our way of living, a lot of the heritage buildings or old houses, old architectures, they kind
Sorry,
of
Hugo. I
Yes.
don't see the slide moving. Are you still showing the cover of the book?
Not yet, not yet. I'm still talking about adaptive reuse first, and then I'll
Sorry,
go
thank
into
you. No problem.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So a lot of the heritage building become irrelevant to modern life. So maybe for political reason or for commercial reasons. So they became vacant or abandoned, and then they were in need of a new life. And then this new life would require a suitable, appropriate new use. So for example, old factories in the commercial, in the industrial area of Shanghai, because of the change of time. So all the industry areas were relocated further down to the outskirts. So the city center, there's no more factory or no more industrial uses. So all these buildings or factories, warehouses become irrelevant and underutilized. So in order to keep them, instead of knocking everything down and we develop into new buildings, in order to keep them, we need to give them a new use, a new appropriate use. And so that would be what we talked about, adaptive reuse. And in this book, I actually use the metaphor of the incarnation of heritage building, meaning these heritage buildings, they have a previous life, like a former life. When they were first constructed, they serve a certain use. So for example, the factory, they serve a factory use for the industrial use, but then over time, the use has changed or they have moved out. So they need a new use to sustain this building. We need to give a new life to it. So that is why when we look at adaptive reuse project, I would say after the reincarnation, we need to look at not just the current life, not just the afterlife. We need to know what it was like in the previous life. So what it was like when it was built, why it was built, where it was, and how the surrounding fabric has evolved over time so that you can better evaluate this particular adaptive reuse project. And that is why today I would first like to talk about the history of the Shanghai's historic city center first, and so that you can better appreciate the suitability of these adaptive reuse projects that I'm going to go through. So this is the map of Shanghai today. And first, I would like to raise a question to all of you. How many of you have been to Shanghai? For those who have been to Shanghai, maybe you can type in the chat box, like, or raise your hand, or +1, so that I have a rough idea how many of you kind of know the city. So Punto have been to Shanghai. How many times?
Just once.
Once, for
Yeah.
academic conferences.
Yeah. To Witrap.
Tourists.
Witrap, yes.
Okay.
Only for workshop. So boring.
What do you think of Shanghai? Did you get to walk around Shanghai?
Unfortunately, no.
Just
Only went to the moon.
trapped in the workshop.
Yes, exactly.
Like your time in Hong Kong at Hong Kong View, right?
Yeah, same.
Okay, I know that feeling. And okay, I see a couple more of you have been to Shanghai. So for those who have been to Shanghai in person, or maybe some of you have read about it or saw on TV programs about Shanghai. So you may recognize, or in your mind, you may have an image of all these skyscrapers of Pudong area, and also maybe the old colonial architecture, the bank buildings along the Bund. So these are the mental image of Shanghai that is most representative. And if you look at this map of modern Shanghai, so I would like to kind of orient all of you and show you some of the landmarks or the natural features of Shanghai, so you can better orient yourself. So the most important or the most famous, I would say, feature of Shanghai would be Huangpu River. So on the eastern side, which is Pudong, Dong actually means east. So Pudong actually means east of Pudong, Huangpu River. So that is where you will find all the high-rise tower. And on the west of it, which we call the Puxi area, which is the west of Huangpu River. So that is where all the colonial architecture were located in. And then another major feature of Shanghai City is Suzhou Creek or Suzhou River. So that used to be the industrial area. And later on, a lot of the projects that I talk about, especially the industrial legacy or industrial heritage assets are actually located along Suzhou River. And then another feature that is quite prominent would be the old Chinese city. So this used to be walled city. So there used to be a wall around there. Like most typical Chinese old city, there used to be wall. But in the old days, most of them were rectangular. But this one is actually not that old. So it's not really that rigid, not rectangular. But around there were a lot of other Western development back then. So I will go through it a bit later. So after identifying these major features of Shanghai city center, so I would like to show you this. So this is the bond, as I mentioned before. So you will see all these old colonial buildings. So for Shanghai, as compared to other nearby cities like Nanjing or Suzhou or Hangzhou, Shanghai is relatively young, even though it's already over like 700 years old. But you know, Chinese city, some of them are like 2,000-3,000 years old. So Shanghai comparatively is quite young. And it was mostly developed after 1850s, after the colonial period. And along the bund is where you would find all these bank buildings that was mostly built during the colonial period by the British and the French. And then on Pudong, the Pudong side, this is also very important. So today when you go, everyone will recognize this, like the Pearl of the Orient Tower, Jinmao Tower, Shanghai Tower. So these iconic skyscraper became the signature of Shanghai. But you have to bear in mind that all these new development of Pudong, they were actually built quite recently, after 1990s. And before that, actually everything was concentrated in the historical part. So the western part of the river is the historic city center. And then the eastern part, all these high-rise, they only appeared after 1990s. So from this old photo, you will see back then it was just like farm and villages. And then another important part of Shanghai is the old Chinese city, as I mentioned. So this is a city god temple. So in most Chinese cities, the old cities, in the city centers, they use always a city god temple. So this god would kind of protect the entire city. And then there are also famous restaurants, and then also this famous landscape bridge. It's a 9-curved bridge. And then around it, there are traditional Chinese restaurants. So for example, today you may have heard of like Xiaolongbao. I think like Crystal J in Jakarta, right? So Crystal J is a Singaporean restaurant, I think. So they are famous for Xiaolongbao. But actually Xiaolongbao is actually originated in area near Shanghai or in that southern region, like Hangzhou, Nanjing, Shanghai. So one of the oldest and most famous Xiaolongbao restaurant is still located in this area. Okay, so that is the traditional Chinese city of Shanghai. And then Suzhou Creek or Suzhou River, as I mentioned before, this used to be the industrial area of Shanghai. So along the creek, even up until the 90s, it was quite polluted because there were a lot of cargo ships and then a lot of factories and go down warehouses. So it was quite heavily polluted. And it was not until the last 10, 15 years that it got rejuvenated. And now along the river, there are a lot of public spaces and open spaces that people can enjoy. But in the old days, like starting 1900s, all the way up until like 5-10 years ago, it was still quite polluted. And a lot of the projects, in fact, one of the earliest adaptive reuse project, which is a warehouse, is actually called Suzhou Creek 1305, I think. So it's actually along, it's located along this Suzhou Creek. And that project I will also talk about a bit later. And for Shanghai, today tourists will also recognize Nanjing Road pedestrian street. So this is where all these department store and rather high-end or mid-end shops and department stores are located in. And this is quite touristy and busy, day and night, rain or shine. So you will always see people. And it's been like that for almost 100 years. So during the heyday of the concession area, so the biggest department store like Wing On or Sincere department store, they have both been relocated to Hong Kong. So they are still kind of the biggest local department store in Hong Kong, but their origins were actually from Shanghai. And during the Civil War, they both moved to Hong Kong. And this used to be in the British concession area. And the other commercial street that is very important is Huaihai Road Commercial Street. This used to be in the French concession area. So later on, I will go through about the British and the French, how to differentiate all these historic quarters. So Huaihai Road Commercial Street is located in the French concession back in the day. So whatever the British built, the French would have kind of a similar or counterpart, kind of compete with each other. So this is like the commercial street in the French border. And today it's still one of the easiest and important commercial street. So at one end, you may find all these new modern developments, the high office towers that were built after the 1990s. And then at the other, in the midsection, you can still see some of the old heritage buildings, such as this cafe cinema, and also other shipment developments. And some of them have been adaptively used as commercial use, or they have been upgraded as like loft apartments. And then at the end, kind of towards the end, the western end of Huaihai Road is also a very important heritage building. This is actually designed by a very famous Hungarian architect, Hudak, who designed quite a number of important buildings during the concession era of Shanghai. And this is one of its iconic buildings. So this residential tower used to be one of the most upscale residential units in Shanghai. Okay, so now that you have a rough understanding of the geography of Shanghai city, I would like to talk about the historical events. So this is pretty much to go through the very basic. So as I mentioned before, Shanghai is relatively a young city compared to other nearby cities like Hangzhou or Nanjing. So it was only set up as a town on Puxi, so on the western part of Huangpu River. Okay, so it was only set up as a town as late as 1265. So it's only less than 800 years. And then a few decades later, Shanghai County was established. So that was kind of the beginning of the city of Shanghai. But back then, it was still quite just more like a fishing village or kind of a rural area compared to the inland cities like Hangzhou or Nanjing. They used to be capitals of China from at different time, at different period or different dynasty. Okay, so those were the city. Those were the really commercial or cultural capitals of China back in the days. And then Shanghai is kind of the outskirts. And then in 1842, that was during the war, the Opium War. So China was defeated by the British. And so this Treaty of Nanking was signed. And China was compelled to open 5 seaports, trading ports along the eastern coast for foreign trade. So before, China was quite reluctant. They didn't want too much Western influences, but because they were defeated in the war, so they signed this treaty. And Shanghai was one of the treaty ports, trading port for international trade that they were forced to open. So I think at the same time it was Tianjin, Xiamen, Ningbo, and Guangzhou, I think, yeah, Canton. So Shanghai was one of them. And it was not until the signing of this treaty, so foreigners, especially British, could legally move to Shanghai to live there, to settle there, and also to conduct trading or businesses. And so a few years after opening up of Shanghai to foreign trade, so the British government requested for a British settlement area so that they can, within Shanghai city, they can have a small area. At first, it was rather small, just a very small area, so that the British nationals can live in that area and they could feel safe and protected. So this is kind of like a area within a city. Okay, so the British settlement first started, and it was quite small to begin with, only 56 hectares. And then around the same time, the American also requested for a settlement area, and it was a bit north. So the British settlement was first in kind of in the south of Suzhou Creek, Suzhou River, and then the American settlement was in the north of Suzhou Creek. So both quite small, just like an isolated area. And over time, the British settlement expanded. And a few years later, the French requested kind of follow suit, and they also requested a similar settlement area, but they call it concession. I think in French it's concession. So actually it's the same concept, but it's the British in English. It's called a settlement area, but then for the French, it's called concession area. But in both cases, it's kind of like a quarter within Shanghai city. So one is for the British, one for the American, and one for the French. So again, over time, the British and the French, they kind of compete against each other. And then they kept expanding their concession area and settlement area respectively. And because the closer relationship between the American and the French, they actually merged in 1863. So British settlement area and American settlement area merged to form the American settlement area. Okay, and the French still kept their own. They still have their own turf, so their own neighborhood. And another important event is the 1911. That was the Qing dynasty, the last monarchy, the last dynasty in China was overthrown, and so China became Republican China. And that was also the time when the old city wall, as I showed you earlier on the map. So the Chinese old city used to be walled city, okay? But now, because the government or the king, the emperor was overthrown, so they want to liberate everything. So the wall, the city wall was diminished, or they actually demolished the wall. But today, when you go, you may still see the shape of it, even though there's no more city walls, okay? In 1914, that was the last and also the biggest expansion of the French concession. Okay, so at first it was only 142 hectares, and then in less than 5 decades, at the last expansion, it expanded to 1,010 hectares. So later on, I will show you graphically how these expansions were like geographically. Okay, so it's actually quite an expansion or quite a growth in less than 5 decades. It grew like almost 15 times. So graphically, if you look at this, so you still recognize this, right? The Huangpu River, Suzhou River, Suzhou Creek, and this is the old Chinese wall city. Okay, so when Shanghai was first opened as a treaty port, so the British set up their British settlement area. Okay, so at first it was quite small. So it occupied kind of along the western part of Huangpu River. So these are where you will find all these bank buildings today, the heritage bank buildings. Okay, they started here. And then American settlement area, it wasn't as demarcated, it was not as rigid. So just American people kind of scattered and lived north of Suzhou River. and then British settlement area slowly expanded. And 1849, the French also requested to have a French concession area. And this is kind of south of the British settlement area and also along Huangpu River. So still it will continue all these Western design bank buildings, right? So this is where the bond is today. And it kind of encroached or wrapped around the Chinese wall city because they could not build into the wall city. Chinese wall city was still belong to the Chinese government. And then these settlement and concession area belong to the respective French and British governments or under their management or their rule. And then over time, French concession expanded. And 1863, the British and the American settlement area merged to form the international settlement. So you can see it actually entailed quite a large area by then. And you will see they kind of also encroach along Suzhou Creek. So that is why they have all these industrial buildings or industrial factories built along the river. And then along Huangpu River, it was the bank commercial uses. And again, the French also requested and expanded the area over time. So it was like a competition. Every 5-10 years, they would ask the Chinese government, I want more land, we have more people. And so it kept expanding. And in 1912, the Chinese city wall was dismantled. And this is the last extension of the French concession. So by 1914, so after the last expansion, so this is very much the extent of the French concession area and the international settlement. So you will see it pretty much encompassed the entire Shanghai city center today. So today when you go to the city center, except Pudong, except like these iconic skyscrapers that were built in the 90s. So pretty much today when you go to the city center, most of it belong either to the international settlement area or the French concession area. That's why when you walk around or when you drive around Shanghai old city, you can see all these Western style architectures. Okay, so after the defeat, so this is right before the Japanese came in. Okay, so this is the Battle of Songhu, the Battle of Shanghai. So the outskirts of Shanghai and also the west of China was actually severely invaded by the Japanese troops. So Shanghai city, because it was protected, in a way, it was under the foreign jurisdiction, so the British, the American, and the French. So it's kind of like a protective shell. So at that time, the Japanese troop didn't invade yet to Shanghai city. So it was kind of like protected. And it's actually called the isolated island period of Shanghai. So that was 1937 to 1941. So in a way, it was still kind of intact, but people actually knew Japanese at one point or later, they are going to enter the city. So in that period of time, Shanghai was kind of chaotic, but at the same time, people were very kind of enjoying this escapism. So because they knew Shanghai is going to fall sooner or later, but at the same time, they were still protected. So they kind of just seized the day. And then in 1941, the foreign powers, the French, the British, and the American, they also surrounded, and so they conceded, and Shanghai fell under the Japanese occupation. And for over 3 years and 8 months, so Japanese kind of have control over China. And at the end of the Second World War, so Japanese lost, and so the Japanese army surrendered the concession area, not back to the concession government, not to the French or to the British. They actually returned the land back to the Chinese. So Shanghai was, as a whole, was returned to the Chinese government. But back then, another problem was the civil war, because China was actually under the civil war between the Nationalist Party, which have later relocated to Taiwan, and also the Communist Party. So in this period of time, Shanghai was still kind of chaotic. And until 1949, the People's Republic of China, which is the Communist Party, so they took over, or they won the entire China. So Shanghai as a whole was also become part of the People's Republic of China. And through this communist rule, so a lot of changes were made. So for example, all these Western bank buildings along the bond, they were nationalized. So they were kind of taken over by the government. They centralized the control. So these banks buildings do not belong to those banks anymore because the bank already moved out back to their own country. So all these buildings, so the government would own it, and then they would kind of relocate, or they would subdivide the ownership to different government departments. So sometimes they would use it as office, or they would use it as storage. So all these bank buildings, they were kind of underused, or kind of not well taken care of for quite a few decades. So that is why at the time China opened up again, so all these buildings were kind of in desperate need of repair. And not just the bank building, a lot of the private mansion of the wealthy people who kind of moved to Hong Kong or to Taiwan or to other part of the world, all these houses were vacant. And so the government would also subdivide the houses and let different households to move in. So for example, one house, a big mansion, used to own by one wealthy person, one wealthy family. Later on, after the 1950s, it would accommodate quite a number of families. So also the living condition and the housing condition also deteriorated quite rapidly over those decades. And also the Great Leap Forward movement, and also the Cultural Revolution, with kind of relocate a lot of the young people to the countryside or the inland, the poor provinces of China. So a lot of the houses or factories in Shanghai, such as Shanghai or Beijing, they also became vacated, and people really took good care of them. So that is also why by the time China opened in the 90s, all these houses or architectures were quite run down. And in 1978, open door policy was announced. So there was economic reform, and also the Chinese government, the Communist Party, realized that they need to attract foreign investments, not just locally. They cannot really sustain, so they need to invest foreign investment, including those from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Western countries as well. So in 1988, so the Communist Party was just kind of experimenting. So over time, at first they just privatized everything or nationalized everything, but over time they realized this is not really working. So they kind of reprivatized some of the sector. So for example, housing. So at one point under communist rule, all the housing were provided by the working company. For example, I work for a factory. So the factory will provide housing for me as a dormitory. I don't have to pay for it. But over time, the Chinese government realized this is not really working. So they kind of allow private housing transaction and also land transaction. So land pieces can be transacted to private developers, and also housing unit can also be sold as private properties. Okay, so this is they're actually changing. Not strictly speaking, this is not communist anymore. In a way, this is kind of a capitalist mode of production, you may say. And then in the 1990s, this economic reform continued, and a lot of these state-owned work units, these state-owned enterprises, or SOE. So when the Communist Party first took over, most of these factories or these companies were state-owned. So nothing is private. Everything is either state-owned or related to the government. So government would own some part of it at least. Nothing is private, entirely private. But in the 90s, the government started to go through this restructuring. So they actually allow state-owned company to privatize gradually. So slowly, so they would have to be responsible for their own finances. So they need to figure out ways to sustain themselves. So they cannot rely on the government all the time because the government realized that it's not working. So a lot of these state-owned enterprises, they used to own factories or buildings in the city center. They would relocate to the outskirts. So for example, they would move to northern part of Shanghai. So they moved the steel factory, the steel plants to the northern part. And so the original compound, the original factory site were vacant. So they could think of other ways, either to rent it out or lease it out so that they can make money. They can have income to sustain their business. So that started in the 90s and kind of intensified after year 2000. And that also very much related to a lot of adaptive reuse projects in China, not just Shanghai, especially those industrial heritage sites. Okay, so remember this map that you saw? So this is the map of Shanghai during the concession period. So one point I would like to make clear is sometimes we talk about Shanghai as a colonial history, but in fact, Shanghai was never a colony of other country. It was only a concession or a settlement area. So like I said before, in the British and the American, they call it the settlement area. And in the French, they call it concession area. So they only manage or they only rule a certain area, a quarter within Shanghai city. Okay, unlike Hong Kong or Singapore, Hong Kong and Singapore was a British colony at one point. So the entire city was under British rule, but Shanghai was quite different. So even during this concession era, so it was still, you may still feel the tension between different foreign governments. Okay, so it's not a colonial city, and it was never a colonial city. Okay, so back to the concession day, that is the end of the concession period. So you see French concession, international settlement, and the Chinese War City, they all occupy very important part of Shanghai city center. And that will take us to today. And in 2005, the Shanghai government actually realized a lot of these historical important or culturally important districts or quarters. So either the French, part of it is the French, part of it is the international settlement and the Chinese War City. They realized they're all distinctive cultural or historical quarters. And so they actually designated different historical and cultural heritage areas in Shanghai. And actually, it covers almost 1/3 of the inner city area of Shanghai today. So if you look at the map, so there are several different cultural distinctive areas. So for example, along the Bund, so that is the Bund area, and also the Nanjing Street, pedestrian street. And then also this is the War City, the former China Old City. And this is the People's Square. So that is part of the French or maybe British settlement area. And this big part is pretty much the former French concession area. So based on their different character or his history historical layer, so the government, the Shanghai government actually designated different historical and cultural area for different protection. Okay, now that you have a rough idea of the Shanghai geography, I would like to show you some of the important adaptive reuse projects. How are we doing with time? Sorry.
I think pretty good. You still have half an hour to go, I think, right,
Okay.
Omo?
Okay, good. So I'll talk a little bit about an overview of these important milestone adaptive reuse projects and how they fit in the urban fabric and in the history or the evolution of the Shanghai city center. And then later on, I will probably talk in more detail about one particular project. Okay. So this is the first project, adaptive reuse project that people recognize. So this is one of the first, relatively small scale. So this is what I mentioned. This was located in along Suzhou River. So it was the old industrial area. Okay, so along it there were a lot of warehouses and factories. So this is one of them. So it was a former rice warehouse, and it was redesigned by a Taiwanese interior architect and also an artist. He's called Deng Kunyan. Early on in the 80s and 90s, he's actually started to do a lot of adaptive reuse back in Taipei. Actually, he would convert some old houses into kind of a nostalgic theme restaurants. So kind of like people would go there and feel romantic and stuff like that. And then in the late 1990s, he moved to Shanghai, and then he saw the opportunity of a lot of these abandoned or run down old buildings. And then he rent one of these warehouses and converted into his own offices. Or they also rent the office because it's a 3-story house. So he also allow other people to rent as well, mostly artists or fashion designers. And then, so if you look at it, this is the location of this 1305 South Suzhou Road. So it is along Suzhou Creek. And you see this is how it looked like after adaptive reuse. So the exterior is quite mundane, actually. It's quite boring. So, but the interior is more interesting. They actually open it up. So there's a skylight. And at the same time, because it's a small scale project, and I suspect he didn't have a big budget as well. So everything is quite minimalist. He tried to keep a very minimalist approach. So he just opened up the skylight to let light in. So he opened it as a communal area, so that people, all these office workers who rent the space, or the artists, they can come to this communal area. And sometimes they would also hold like catwalk for fashion show, or like news conferences, like press conferences. So this is the main space. But other than that, they have kept the small units for office uses. And I would like to show a short clip. This is what Suzhou Creek used to look like in 1948 from a very old Chinese movie. And then from this clip, you may also look at Shikuman houses as well, okay? So please pay attention to the condition of the river and the factory, the warehouses, and then it will turn and it will show you some of the Shikuman houses, the very traditional residential units.
I'm not sure whether there should supposed to be an audio with it.
Can you hear?
Very distant.
But it's just background music, actually.
Okay, that's good.
But I would like to get a sense of the concession period of Shanghai. So that's how Suzhou River used to look like. All these are trading boats and ships and factories and warehouses. And then on the other side, you may see some residential towers, and then some more factories and warehouses, and some residential, and also churches. So those are the residential communities. And you see those churches and also clock towers. And these are the shikumen houses. So these are very typical residential houses during the concession period. And this is quite typical, usually 2 to 3 story. This is a typical interior. Okay, so earlier on I mentioned these are shikumen houses, right? Shikumen actually means stone. The first character is stone, frame, door. So because these at first they were mostly built by Western developers. So when the British and the French first came, and they need to house or accommodate their residents, so they built these very much in a British or European style. They are kind of like the British row houses. So a lot of houses they kind of lined up together like attached house, row houses. So usually 2 to 3 story brick houses. And at first, when they were first constructed in the late 1800s, they were mostly catered to the expat, so-called, the British or the French, the wealthy Westerners who worked for the government or who did trading in Shanghai. But then over time, starting around early 1900s, also the local developer also engaged in this kind of shikumen housing unit development. So starting then, they have like a wide range of shikumen houses development. Some are quite like for the middle class, and some are kind of for the lower class. So even the working people could afford. But of course, the lower range housing unit would be a bit tighter, smaller, and sometimes one house may even house 4, even 6 different families. So maybe one family only rents a small, the back room of the house, and then they will share a communal kitchen. Okay, so these kind of shikumen architecture also kind of evolved over time. And one of the first project, adaptive reuse project, this one is more bigger in scale. So this is actually a large shikumen housing neighborhood, and the whole neighborhood over time it was converted from residential use to a mixed use, so including commercial and office and boutique shop and artist studio as well. So this kind of took over a decade of time, and then it slowly changed. And so as I said before, when we evaluate adaptive reuse project, I would also like you to look at that before the adaptive reuse effort actually came in. So let's take a look at this. This is actually from the 1991 movie, and this is also filmed in Shanghai, in the French or in the former French concession area. So this is also very typical shikumen housing development. So you will see after the concession era, so after the Republic of China and after communist Chinese took over, you will see for 4, 5 decades, these houses were quite overused. So they were kind of like occupied, it would accommodate 6 or a lot of family in one house. So the houses, the condition kind of deteriorate quite rapidly. And this clip will show a very typical interior and also the way of life of these shikumen house residents back in the 1990s, before all these adaptive reuse efforts came in play. So again, this is a view of the one. So you see the silhouette of these colonial or the Western design bank buildings. And then this is a very typical shikumen residential housing development. Okay, so these are mostly built in 1920s and 1930s. So this is actually called Obrolan. So I think it's actually in the French concession area. So different households will share one communal kitchen, usually on the ground floor. And sometimes if there are too many households, like 6 or 7 families, just one kitchen is not enough. And they would also take over the outdoor space, and they would put their stove and their sink outside in the outdoor area. And then you'll see these are the very typical alleyway. So all the houses are kind of arranged in row, like row houses. And then each house, you will see the stone frame door. So one stone frame is one housing unit. So this is a very typical Shikuman design. So back to this first large-scale adaptive reuse project. So this is actually converted from a Shikuman housing neighborhood first. And it was first developed by, or actually initiated by a group of artists. So this project, Tianzifa, is located in the former French concession area, not far from the Huaihai Road commercial street. So this is kind of in the heart of the former French concession area. And it first started as just one small alley. So in this alley, there are Shikuman houses and some small factories on the other side. So the artists like this environment and also like the vacant small factory space. So because one of the earliest artists, Chen Yifei, is actually, he also spent a lot of time before moving back to Shanghai. He spent some time in New York as an artist. So he actually rented some Soho, some loft space in Soho. So he lived there as in an old factory building, and also treated it as his studio. So when he moved back to Shanghai, he was looking for something similar to that. So he looked for some small factory space and in a residential neighborhood, and he kind of decided to move into Tianzifa. So that is one of the first. It used to be a very quiet residential neighborhood. And later on, when I have time, this is one of the detailed case study. So you will see how it has evolved in 10 years of time. It has totally changed. And another similar project kind of happened hand in hand with Tianzifa, the former project. This is also a residential Shikuman neighborhood. And then it was acquired by a private developer, which is a Hong Kong developer, share on property. And so in terms of scale, they are quite similar in terms of area. But then the first one, so it was initiated by a group of artists and the local residents. So it was more like a bottom-up adaptive reuse project. And then this one is kind of like a wholesale. So the private developer, with the help of the local government, they acquire the entire neighborhood. It's kind of like 2 blocks of Shikuman houses and kind of redevelop the whole thing. So the houses were kept and with some demolition, but then most of the houses were kept, but they were all changed to different uses, mostly high-end restaurants, boutique shops. So this is the private, more top-down approach. And then the last one, Tianzifa, it was kind of like a bottom-up. So even though some of the houses have been converted for commercial use or office uses, usually only the ground floor or only the second floor were converted. And then some of the residents will still live on the upper levels of those residential units. And so kind of like a mixed use. So you will still see existing residents living there, and then the lower floor have been changed to commercial uses. So the other project, this is led by the private developer. So this is Xinjiandi. So you will see also 2 blocks. Originally, there were 2 blocks of Shikuman houses. And then after adaptive reuse, they kind of open up some of the houses. They have to demolish some of the houses for open spaces and circulation. And they also certain new development to justify the land cost. So you will have some other uses. There's a boutique hotel, and there's a small shopping mall with a cinema and some restaurants as well. And this is actually a office tower and some restaurants on the ground. And I actually used to, when I worked in Shanghai, actually my office is actually somewhere here in this office tower. So like I said, so the developer actually acquired the entire land, so they could do quite heavy-handedly the changes for the renovation. So it's kind of like a quite heavy-handed. It's very sanitized. So today, when you go there, it's actually very popular. Even after 20 years, it's still very popular. It has become kind of like a landmark for Shanghai. When Shanghainese have friends coming to visit, they would like to take them to Xintiandi just to show them. Because this is very Shanghainese in a way. It's where the East meets West. Shanghainese are always very proud of their Shanghainese roots or their culture. We are very modern and very hip. So we have all these Western influences for a long period of time. Even 100 years ago, we are already so fashionable. And even today, if you go there, it's still a very hip place to show off. Okay, and then this is a very important industrial heritage adaptive reuse project. So this is M50. It started in 2001. So again, this is actually a compound. It used to be a compound of factories, also along Suzhou Creek. So this is kind of towards the end of the former international settlement area. But along Suzhou Creek, there used to be all industrial development. Okay, so it's actually a group of factory houses. So again, these architectures, they may look quite boring, quite boxy, but again, the interior is actually very user-friendly. So a lot of artists and also, for example, I remember before Epson, there's the printing company. They also rent this space as their gallery so that they can show off their new technology, and also they have their office space there as well. And I'll show you a very short clip of Suzhou River back in year 2000. So you will get a sense of how the river used to be like before any adaptive reuse took place, okay? And it's actually quite polluted, and you would starting to see some new development along the opening of Suzhou Creek to Pudong area. Yeah, so up until year 2000, it's still very polluted. A lot of factories were under demolished, either being demolished or were vacant. Today, when you go to Suzhou Creek, it's totally different. You only see some of these old factories. And you don't see that many boats or cargo ship anymore. And as you go towards the end of Suzhou Creek, and then you will see Pudong area. And around year 2000, you will start to see these Pudong development, like the Pearl of the Orient. and Jinmao Tower. So that is quite typical. And in fact, a lot of these factories that have been acquired by some of these, because now along Suzhou Creek, there's a lot of high-end residential development, like residential towers, because of the river view. So actually a big selling point. So some of these high-end residential development, they would acquire the factory or the warehouses building in front as their clubhouse. It's actually quite popular these days. So they would like to sell these clubhouses as their legacy, as a most. So we are at a very historical, important area. So when you live along Suzhou Creek, you're actually living at a prime location, and then you would see the history of the prime Shanghai in the old days. So all these industrial heritage became very important for Shanghai, not just commercial houses, but also for residential use. And then, okay, apart from the industrial heritage, another important project, which I would like to talk more later, if time allowed, is Bund 18. So the Bund, again, is the western of Pudong River. So that's where you see all these westernized bank buildings, right? So Bund 18 is actually because it's the building number is number 18 on the Bund, and which is actually Zhongshan Second Road. So number 18 Zhongshan Second Road is actually Bund 18. So it used to be a Indonesian or no, Indian bank. I think it was an Indian bank. So when it was first constructed, so it was constructed in 1923, and then after the communist government took over China, so they nationalized all these bank buildings, and this particular building was allocated to one government department, and they use it as their office space. So from 1950s all the way until almost year 2000, so this heritage building was used as a government office, and it was kind of run down. And this, the adaptive reuse was actually done by two Italian architects. So it was so the government was looking for foreign investment, so to redevelop these houses. They want to keep these houses, but at the same time they need money. So they try to attract foreign investment. So in this case, it was actually a Taiwanese company who came in, and then they selected this particular bank building, and then they leased it for 30 years, I believe. And then they hire two young Italian architects from Venice to conduct the restoration and also the adaptive use of this project. So this is actually the Bund.
We do not have questions, Hugo. I think you can just proceed with the second case.
Okay. Yes, so this is the Bund, this one closer to us. And then further down is the AIA building, the Peace Hotel. So all these are the important Western style bank building that you can still see today. And so it's actually in the former British settlement area. And this case, you will find more details in the book or in the next presentation, which I will share with you or share with the kingdom. So you have a lot of detailed information about the development and the financial, about the financial stability of this project from the other file. Okay, and then later on in the next year, 2005, this is also an industrial project. And this time around, this is not along Suzhou Creek. This is actually in the former French concession area. Okay, I think I forgot to mention. So remember the French concession government, they actually asked for a few series of expansion, right? So at the very last expansion, it was a very big expansion. And it was also during that time, the French government also started to enforce very strict planning or zoning plans. So in the past, when they first get small pieces of land, so they just put some residential there, some small factory there, and sometimes these land uses, they were not compatible. So there were some conflicts. Then last expansion, when they realized they have this big opportunity, they have a big kind of a greenfield land. So they started to enforce some planning or zoning ideas. And so at that expansion, the government actually zoned different areas. So for example, they have in the southern part, they would allow for industrial use and even slightly polluting industrial use. And then in the northern part is mostly for residential. And then they would also specify certain area would be residential design with Western style villa. And then some are middle class, so these maybe more dense development, and some more high-end villa development. And in the south of it, it would allow some kind of industrial development because for a small port to sustain itself, it got to have like commercial, residential, and industrial. And it was not until the last expansion that the French actually enforced this kind of zoning and planning law. And this Red Town, what is now known as Red Town, was actually one of the industrial development back then. So it was a big piece of land in the former French concession area. And after the French concession period ended, when the Chinese government took over, so it was allocated to a state-owned enterprises. So it was one of the biggest steel company in China back then, Baoshan Steel Company. So they owned the whole compound, and it was actually composed of a dozen of houses and buildings, including dormitories, factories, storage, and manufacturing plants. So this is one of the biggest industrial adaptive reuse projects in Shanghai. And then another interesting project, adaptive reuse, is the Shanghai 1933. It's actually built as a slaughterhouse. So this is where all the cows and pigs were sent to be slaughtered. But it's actually a very nicely designed building, if you look at this. So this is in the former international settlement area. And it was actually designed by a British architect. And if you look at it, even though it's a slaughterhouse, it's actually very nicely designed with some Art Deco elements. So back in the 1930s, it's actually very avant-garde ideas. And in fact, the use of it, the architectural layout, is very functional. So it looks funky, but in fact, it served a purpose. So they would, when you have all these livestock, the cow or the cattle, they would drop them off on the ground floor, and then they would send them up the ramp, and then they will be slaughtered, and then they will be stored at the next building and dropped back down. So they have a very logical program here. And this used to be the ramp where the cattle or the pig will be sent. So this is a short clip of this building in the old days. And this is where they sold the beef. And actually, we used to take our students to Shanghai every other year to look at these adaptive reuse projects. And then the first couple of years when we went visit this site, we couldn't quite figure out how it worked. We guessed they would just kind of kick and make the animal go up the ramp, but then we couldn't quite figure out. And then later on, when I did my research for this book, and then I came across this old movie clip, and then I was quite surprised. Actually, there's some documentary or some documentation of this in the old days. Okay, and then another similar project to Bond 18. This is also by the same architect, actually the two Italian architects. Because of the success of Bond 18, so another developer is actually Italian, is Dunhill, the luxury brand company. So they picked, they wanted to have a showroom in Shanghai Historic Center, and so they picked this location. It's actually one of or two villas, kind of tucked inside Huaihai Road Commercial Street. So this is like the busiest area in the former French concession days. But it's not on the commercial street. It's actually tucked inside. So you have to go through this arcade. You have to go through this building, and then you will see two villas. And actually, it was when after this used to owned by a local Shanghainese wealthy family, and then after 1949, the whole family fled to America, I think. So no one, so these buildings were again nationalized by the government, and it was at one point served as a government office and also as a travel agent and also cinema at different point of time between 1949 up until 2005 before this adaptive reuse project. And so these two Italian architects, again, similar to Bond 18, they would try to adhere to minimal intervention principle. So, and then they would have a lot of, documentation and try to read into the historical layer or the patina of these houses, and they would recreate some of the details based on historical records. So this is actually the architect, the Italian architect. He was explaining this project to our student during our visit. And so a lot of the details were nicely restored or replicated, but based on authentic historical record. And they also have some new addition. So they at the back of it. So it's actually across from these historical twin towers. And they always would stress that the new addition should remain distinguishable. And everyone who go there, they would immediately notice that these are the new addition and what is the heritage part and what is the new. So so there are two principles. One is minimal interventionist, and the other is reversibility. Okay, so the new addition should always be, if it's added to the heritage building, they should be reversible. And then the last project I would like to talk about is along the South Bund. So as I mentioned before, the Bund used to be the busiest and most important commercial hub of Shanghai. And because the land is so expensive, so recently, in the last decade or so, the Shanghainese government started to capitalize on this Bund concept. So now it's not just the Bund. Instead, they have the North Bund and also the South Bund. So they try to capitalize this so that the frontage of Bund kind of expanded. In the past, this is actually a very industrial and polluted area in the northern part. But today, they call it the North Bund. And then the new development here, they can also enjoy the reputation of being along the Bund, and the same for the South Bund. So this project, the water house at South Bund, was built in 2010. That was the year where the Shanghai World Expo opened, and that was the year when Shanghai was receiving a lot of foreign guests. And this project was actually quite upscale, even though it's just a small warehouse in the old days. And also this house was the Japanese headquarters for the Japanese army during the Japanese occupation. So in a way, the history of this building was quite sensitive. So the local people or the Chinese government tried not to promote the history of it, but at the same time they realized this is a very historically important building, because even though it's just a warehouse or shipyard building, but because for almost a decade it served as the Japanese army headquarters. So that part of history they didn't want to erase, but at the same time they wouldn't really promote it. And again, this project was done by two architects. It's a couple actually, both of them educated from Harvard, and I think they moved to Shanghai around early 2000. And this is one of the projects that made them famous. And again, first because this is a very important heritage building, and at the same time because of the sensitivity of this history. So they also adhere to the minimal intervention principle. So if you go there, you can still see the walls still remain kind of like unpainted, and some of the metal are quite rusty. So this is the exterior. And same for the interior. Sometimes it may even look a bit contrived. I'm not sure if they intentionally made it like that. So they kind of sell the patina of this old house, so they can still see the stains or the scars of this building here and there. Okay. So maybe I will stop here about the overview of these projects.
So we have, thank you so much, Hugo. So we have about half an hour to discuss before we end the session. There are two questions popping up in the chat. I can read through it. I also have a few questions my side. Yeah, it's from Ria. Hi, Hugo, long time no see. Wants to ask questions. Yeah, that's Ria. Is there any gentrifications? Oh, sorry, hang on. Just before I jump to the questions, I'm very exciting. Thank you very much for the presentations. I forget to mention in the earlier when I did the opening before I introduce you. Then I forgot to mention that you have took a huge interest on how the placemaking in urban planning. That's basically your dissertations in your master degree for urban planning, and of course, then we can enjoy the benefit of it. That you showed a few of the video clips in the historical, showing the nuisance of them or showing the ambience of how the old settlements of Shikomen. Thank you for that. And just to summarize, I think we've been thrilled that you have taken us through the historical journey of Shanghai, how it evolves and how it transformed into its form now, starting from the prehistoric area on the Chinese dynasties, and then the concessions with the foreign countries coming to Shanghai, and how it the Japanese occupation in Shanghai, and that's how it transformed basically the face of Shanghai today. And I'm very pleased to also looking at a few cases of the projects on the adaptive reuse, how it is shown in bits and pieces of Shanghai, in the Shanghai city. You have taken us through in the settlement area, how Xintiandi is developed from the settlement, and how the commercial building has also transformed. So I have a few questions on that, but before I become selfish and with entertaining myself with the questions I have, so let me go through the three questions that I have in the chat. Starting from Ria, the first one: is there any gentrification issue in this development area? The second question: is there any incentive scheme from government if someone wants to reuse a heritage building?
Okay.
I will go through it later, but because it's on a separate topic, but we'll go through it later.
Okay, so maybe first I'll address Lia's question. Okay.
Is there any gentrification issue in this development area?
Okay. Yes. Hi, Lia. Long time no see.
Hi, Hugo. Sorry.
Hi. Oh, you're still out. Oh, you're in the car.
Yes.
She's
landing.
coming from.
Are you driving?
So she's traveling outside Jakarta. I think she's coming back to Jakarta now.
Oh, be careful. Are you driving while you're in the car?
No.
Okay. Okay. Hi, Ria. Thank you for the question. And yeah, I think it's a very relevant question, especially when I think not just Shanghai, a lot of the historic city in Asia has been experiencing gentrification issues. And in fact, I think Shanghai is quite prominent, especially in the decade between year 2000 and 2010. I think before 2010, like when Shanghai World Expo opened, actually there's a lot of urban revitalization or beautification project that went on, and actually it kind of gentrified some of the space, some in a good way and some in not so good way. And I think the good thing about Shanghai, not just the government, but at least for Shanghai, they have the government was quite aware. They know what they are doing, and because they know what is important, and they also know from a very practical point of view, they know what are worthy, what are financially important. So for example, in the case of 118 that I talked about earlier on, along the Bund, so that bank building at first, so it was developed in the early 2000s. So back then, the government wasn't as developed and they didn't have much money. So back then, they would rely more on foreign investment. And when they need to attract foreign investment, so of course, they would have certain incentive. So in that particular case, I think they actually signed this, when the Taiwanese developer, when they first came to Shanghai, the government invited them to come to Shanghai, and then the government wanted them to develop or to redevelop or restore some of the bank buildings along the Bund. And they actually let this Taiwanese developer to walk along the Bund and visit every building, and then they can choose which one do you like. And then the Taiwanese developer actually invited the two young Italian architects back there, and they walk together along the Bund. There are over a dozen of heritage buildings. So they used to be Western design bank buildings that were quite significant. And they actually walk every building and they look at it, they evaluate. And then, okay, I picked this one, and then they can actually cut a deal with the government. So they can sign a lease. I think back then they signed a 30-year lease. So again, they didn't own the building, they only signed the lease, but at least they got a certain period of time. So for 30 years, if you put in so much money in it, so it should be justified, and you may expect to have a long period of time of revenue. So I think in a way that is one form of incentive. And then another way is, so this is for a standalone project, right? This is a smaller project. And then for bigger project, for example, like Xinjiang, so I mentioned it was developed by a Hong Kong private developer, right? So again, this Hong Kong developer, they first enter the China market or the Shanghai market, and they built a hotel development, kind of mid-size, I think around 20-story, not a major resort hotel, but kind of a middle-sized hotel development. And then I think from that, they earned the trust of the local government. So they believe this developer, even though they are from Hong Kong, they should know what they are doing. So they have proved to us that they know what they are doing. And so the government allowed them to redevelop the 2 blocks of Shikumen houses. And at the same time, the government would also help them to do relocation, because even today, I think one of the major issues for urban conservation or for urban revitalization is always about relocation. How you can relocate the existing residents, whether you pay them or you offer them a compensation scheme or subsidy, or you renovate and then you keep a portion of land or a portion of residential unit after redevelopment, and you would allow them to move back in. So there are several ways for this kind of relocation compensation. And then that Xintiandi project was one of the first, and then the government actually helped the private developer to do all the relocation. So in a way, they just evicted everyone. And back then, I guess people were not as aware of the value of their old houses. So most of them, they got evicted and were relocated to other part or the newer developed area of Shanghai. But in a way, their living condition have been improved because these are newer units, housing units. And if you remember the clip that I showed you from the 1990s, actually back then, if you live in one of those houses, the living condition was not that desirable. But a lot of people were actually quite happy. They got the compensation package or they got relocated to a newer residential unit. So these are some of the incentives that the government will provide for different scale, for different adaptive reuse projects.
Thank you, Hugo.
Okay.
Okay, for the next question, I think there are two questions that are related to one another. The first one is, of all the projects that of the adaptive reuse projects happening in Shanghai, which one has the most change physically? How to control physical changes? I think this is also related to my questions. How regulated is that the conservation project? Is that any limitations or restrictions imposed to current development?
Okay. Okay. Also, thank you, Ririk. Is it Ririk?
Yes.
Thank you for the question. So I think it's a very interesting question. So I think in terms of the most change physically, I think there are two aspects. So one is in terms of scale. So for example, if it's just a standalone building like 118, so physically they didn't change it as much. Maybe they only restore something. But if you look at a bigger project like Xintiandi or Tianziba, whereby an entire Shikumen housing neighborhood was adaptively reused, so of course, in terms of the scale and extent, more have been changed. But I think when we talk about most change physically, there are also two aspects that we can talk about. Is whether it changed back to the original form or it changed to a newer direction. So for example, in adaptive reuse, sometimes we would allow for certain new changes. So we understand when you have, for example, in TensorFlow, because in a residential house, when you want to convert the lower level, the ground level, to a shop or a restaurant, of course, you have to make quite a lot of changes in order to suit the new use. So all these regulation for fire regulation, for the grease trap, for all these food and safety. So there are, you have to make new changes. But at the same time, whether you think these are biggest or not, I think it should be evaluated case by case based on the new use as compared to the original use. And then another aspect of this question is related to Katina. You asked about how much, or is there any control or any regulation to control these changes, right? So this
Yes.
would be relevant or related to the slide that I showed you. Remember from the concession period and then to today. So in around 2005, the government actually designated like 12, or I think more now, 12 different historical and cultural area in Shanghai city center. And so in fact, in these destinations, in this area, they also have different form of protective measure. So for example, if it's in the Chinese wall city, they may have specific clause saying that any new development cannot be taller than such and such, or it should adhere to the local or to the architectural style and the streetscape. So for example, when I work in a project in Beijing, which is in not far from the Forbidden City, so actually it's a historical part of the city. And for a project like this, usually the city government will set up a committee. So they would call, loosely translated as the architectural style committee. So they would invite like professors from university and historians and architects or very authoritative figures in the field. And then they would have this committee of maybe 5 to 10 people. And so they would evaluate all the architectural drawing and the design, especially the elevation. So when you engage in project like this, not just the usual planning application or just the building code application, but you will also have to go through this architectural style committee so that they will look at each building and look at the height, look at the architectural style, whether it adhere to that particular historic district. So each historic district, each historic area would have its own set of rules. And sometimes when your project, if your project fall into one of these areas, so they would have a specific committee or group kind of safeguard any new development and to make sure that no excessive changes will be made to not just your project or not just to the architecture, but also to the streetscape as well.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Hugo. The next questions that I have, I'm sorry, but I need to go back again to the gentrification. I missed the questions from Umu. How have all these adaptive reuse projects impacted the communities? Do they bring more positive impacts, or did they trigger gentrification and bring negative force to the existing communities living around the areas?
Okay, thank you very much for this question. Actually, this is very relevant to the book that we did. As I mentioned before, so in that book, we have cases. We talk about Shanghai, Singapore, and Hong Kong, right? And then we have selected 5 cases, 5 projects in each city. And in fact, for each project, we just evaluate those projects based on what you just brought up here, the positive or the negative impact. So we look at it in terms of sustainability. So we will look at this social impact, its environmental impact, and also economic impact. Because we believe adaptive reuse project, you cannot just look at it as a standalone project, just floating around at that location. But in fact, you have to look at it from the bigger picture. What good or what bad it brings to not just itself or not just its own surrounding area, but sometimes to the whole district or even to the city of Shanghai, or even in setting is a good example for the whole country, right? So in fact, if you look at, and later on I will share the second part of my presentation, which will contain 2 case studies, detailed case studies, which is 118 and 10-5. So these are actually 2 very different cases. 118 is a private developer and it's a smaller project. So in a way, the evaluation is quite different. And then the other project is a larger community initiated project. And the challenges that they faced and also the impacts that they brought about are quite different. And I hope you will get to read those 2 projects. And if you have time, you may even read into the book, which contain 5 projects in Shanghai and also 5 more in Singapore and 5 more in Hong Kong. And I think those would answer your question about the positive impact and also the negative impact that each of these adaptive reuse projects have brought to their native city.
Sorry, Hugo. I think I missed the point. Whether you still have more slides to present on the cases?
Yes, but it's quite a lot because I mentioned to you, these are the detailed slides. I actually put in some photos and animation just to try to walk everyone through this project. But because I understand it's kind of impossible, because in the past when we studied this project, we would take students actually to Shanghai and look at them in person, and it's much more effective. But for this purpose, I also want to share with all of you the detail of this project. But at the same time, I understand because of the time strain, it will be quite difficult. That's why I prepare these the second part of the presentation so that you can share with everyone later on. So when they have time, we can actually go through. It is quite detailed, actually.
Okay. If we can manage to have within these 10 minutes, go through the 4 questions remaining that we have, then we can spare the remaining time until another 5 minutes or so. Then you can flip through the how, just to get a feeling on how the detail of the interesting projects. Yeah, just appetizing the to the project. But I think it's very interesting. So the next question, I think one very related to the other. The 3 questions. These are on the use of the buildings. This is the first one comes from Baruli, Kusumaruli. Hi Hugo, it is interesting presentation for this project. What is the most challenging situations to justify what kind of functions? So this is related to the use is appropriate with the surroundings environment. And then
which question is this? Is it
Kusumaruli?
Is it the last question?
No, that's the
what time was that? What time was that question? I'm trying to look at it.
Sorry, that is state time mark just before there is Bung Apit and there's Kusumaruli. I think for your timestamp 6:03 p.m.
What is the most challenging situation to justify?
What kind of function is appropriate with the surroundings environment?
Okay.
You got to see the question?
Yes.
Okay.
In which project are you referring to? Kusuma, right?
Yeah, Kusumaruli, Baruli. Is there any chance for you to speak and clarify the questions?
Okay. Are you referring to any project in particular or in general? All these adaptive reuse project?
Maybe if you not sure whether she's here.
Sorry.
Okay.
In general,
in general,
what is the most challenging for this situation? Thank you.
Okay. But I would say for adaptive reuse project, it's quite difficult. Actually, when I share with my class or colleagues, I also find it in a way more interesting, but at the same time more challenging to conduct an adaptive reuse project, because unlike like a generic architectural project, like a new building, it's easier. And in a way, in general, I can talk about like commercial development or residential development. But for adaptive reuse project, it's really case by case. Each project has its own story. And as I said, it's like reincarnation. So you have to look at its current life and also its previous life. Every project is different. It has its own history. It has its own story to tell. So I would say they all face challenging situation in one way or another. And then whether the function is appropriate or not, and again, it's also case by case. So if you get, when you have time, please look at at least the 2 cases that I put in the second part of the presentation, which I will share with the dinner later. And then in that, you will see at least the 2 cases. One is a bigger scale, more private development net, and the other one is a bigger neighborhood scale initiated by community members. So just looking at these 2 projects already, you will see they are facing very different challenges. And at the same time, you have to judge their function and new uses quite different because of their nature, their location, etc.
Just to follow up on this, Hugo. Maybe Mbak Ruli, do you have any follow-up questions, or does that answer?
No, I think so. You can go on with the another questions, maybe.
Sorry, yeah, Hugo, just related on the use of the building. Who defines the use in the current or the future development? Is that the owner?
It really depends. It is case by case. So, for example, in Bund 18, actually the architect has also some input in it. So the developer they saw an economic opportunity, so they decided they would like to invest in this project. So they leased the project from the government, and then they decided to renovate it or restore it. But back then they didn't have a very precise idea what they are going to use it for. So they were actually working alongside the architect. And even today, the architect actually told us, after it has been over 15 years, and then there's a certain turnover rate, right? So every 2-3 years, when tenants move out and then they will have the new tenants, they will still consult the architect and see, oh, do you think these new uses? So for example, at first, some of the floor space have been converted into galleries, like art galleries and bar and bakery and artist space for jewelry, I think upscale boutique. And then over time, they realized actually only the food and beverage, the F&B business will survive. So eventually it kind of changed, the tenant mix changed, but still the developer and also the management of this adaptive reuse project, they will still consult the architect to make sure, do you think these new tenants or these new uses would be compatible to this project? So I guess so. Each time is different, but I think a lot of the time the developer sometimes they have a better idea, but sometimes if they don't, they would even work with other consultants or the architect to determine on the new uses.
Thank you, Hugo. So these two questions are quite related. One is from Fitria. Before we take Punto's question, from Fitria, is there any public space redesign projects or public space revitalizations that stimulate the building owners to adaptively use their assets?
Yes, actually the project that I show, is it the last or second last, Red Town. So I mentioned it was actually a factory or industrial compound, right? So the whole factory operation moved out. And so this tenant, they kind of rent the space, they lease the space from the former state-owned enterprise. So now they have all these disused factory and warehouse spaces. And in fact, it's not just the architecture, not just the whole buildings. It also includes a big lawn in the middle. So it's a big piece of grass area. And so actually the tenant, they converted into an industrial, into a creative industry, a use for creative industry. So they converted into office spaces, and also, for example, like hair salon, they have a live music house, like a music bar, and they also have cafe, and also they have office spaces, and also a art and sculpture area. And then in the middle of that, they display sculpture, and also it also serve as a big public space for people in the neighborhood. In fact, it was quite successful, even though it's not just the tenant within this adaptive reuse site, but also people living around the site. They would come, or the mother would bring their kid in trolleys or carts and send their kids on the grass area to play. So some of these, especially the industrial heritage sites, usually they would have a bigger site, and not just architectural site, but also open area as well.
Okay, the second question is related to the current use. Hi Hugo, this is coming from Sohardi. Concerning Sintiandi project, we learned that there are some public spaces or pedestrian streets introduced in the neighborhood. Is it based on the original urban fabric? Then were those new buildings built on vacant lands or other demolishing or after demolishing old buildings?
In this case, in the case of Xintiandi, I know better because I used to work for the company for this project. And in this particular project, I think the pedestrian streets were not based on original urban fabric. I mean, in a way it is, but they expanded it because of the new use. So in the past, it's only residential use. And in the old days, there actually also a school and a small motel and some small shops. So it's kind of a very mixed development. So residential is kind of very dense and crowded. So, and also because of this use, usually not that many people, only residents or students or school kids would walk these public lanes or alleys, right? But because of the new use, after adaptive use, they need to change it into a entertainment or cultural district. And so they have like all these bars and restaurants and high-end British shop, and also alfresco dining area, which is a big selling point of Xintiandi. And that is why they had to demolish some of the original houses, but usually based on the original lane or original alleyway, and to expand them. And they would evaluate the condition of those houses. So usually they would pick those that are less impact or less significant houses, and then they would demolish it to make wider passageway and also bigger public spaces to serve the new use, which is a cultural and entertainment district.
Okay, so there are more people, there are more questions coming in. I'm sorry, we are at the top of the hour, but is it okay for you to stay back a little bit longer? Do you have time, Hugo? Or
yes.
We overshot by 3 minutes, but do you still have time to answer?
Yes.
There are 5 more questions, I think. Yeah. Would that be okay?
Yes, sure.
Okay. So I think still relevant to this, just the questions will follow through on the same topic. What are the basic rules in implementing this urban revitalization, which ensures the sustainability of the program? Oh, sorry, I'm reading it through, I can put it, no, I cannot put it in the chat, but this is coming in the YouTube live.
Oh, okay.
So I'm reading it through.
Okay.
Or maybe we can just go through the one in Zoom. Then we can go to the questions in YouTube. Hugo, is it okay?
Yeah, sure. So that's one more question from.
One more questions. There are 2 more questions. One is also from Punto, but I put it at the last. Because it's very different topic on the education. So this is coming from Pak Hari Wahyono. According to the main aim of revitalizations in the historical of inner city, how can the adaptive reuse should appreciate the social or local people factors?
I think, in fact, not just for adaptive reuse project, but I would say the social or the local people factor is indispensable. And as I mentioned before, when we look at these adaptive reuse projects, and also from the book, we try to evaluate all these projects based on sustainability. So in a way, social is indispensable. So social, economic, and environmental. And in a way, I think economic and environmental is easiest. I mean, they are numbers, so you can easily financially justify a project, whether it's successful or not, right? Or physically, you can look at the project, whether they really restore it or whether really respect the original fabric or the historical layer. So these two are relatively easy to evaluate. And I think most of the time, the social or the people aspect is the most difficult factor to evaluate. And I'm quite happy to see most of these projects, at least, for example, Tensi Farm or Xintiandi, so they actually provide public spaces, even though people who may not be able to afford it some people will criticize that these projects are only catered to tourists or to the wealthy people who go there for Starbucks or for expensive dinner. But in fact, these projects, they also provide public spaces like the previous question, and also the industrial adaptive reuse project. Oftentimes, they also provide these public spaces that are free of charge. So people around it, or people may actually make a trip to go there and enjoy the public space. So these are something that we cannot put a price tag to. And I think the private developers or the investor behind this project, they also knew, they realized, even though these people, they come to my project, they are not patronizing, they're not spending any money, but they know actually it's doing good for their own project as public publicity and also as public good. I think I'm quite convinced that most of the private developer these days, they will understand the importance of the social aspect. So even though it's a private development in a way, but still they would always welcome people, non-patronizing people to come and enjoy the site. So at the very least, I think these already brought in certain social benefits to each of these projects. But yeah, in short, I do think these social factors are very important.
Thank you, Hugo. So the last question in the Zoom coming from Punto. Hi, Hugo. Are there enough number of architects working on adaptive reuse projects in Shanghai? Or what do they learn in the university, or do they learn at university in specific?
Oh, okay. Hi, Punto. Thanks for the question.
Yes.
And I think the answer is never enough.
Okay.
I think there are more and more, and I think it's a demand and supply question. So in the old days, there are even less architects who engaged in adaptive reuse projects because there were not that many opportunities. But in fact, during my interview, so I talked to architects who worked on these adaptive reuse projects over the past 10, 20 years. Actually, they all told me that they realized the local government, or not just the Shanghainese government, a lot of the local government officials in different parts of China, they started to realize the importance of, or the financial, the money behind these adaptive reuse projects. So for example, after a few successful projects, even though they may be just financially successful, like Xintiandi or Bund 18 or Tianzifa, these projects became like example. So a lot of other city officials from other cities in China, they would travel to Shanghai, they look at this project, and then they realize, oh, in my own city, I also have, you know, most of the Chinese cities are so old. They always have some old buildings waiting to be used or reused, right? So they always wanted to kind of capitalize on these heritage buildings. So I think in a way, these projects in Shanghai actually set a very good example, even though some of them may not be executed in a perfect manner, but still, I think they serve as very good example, and they kind of open the eyes of the private developers and also the government officials of not just Shanghai, but other parts of China as well. And a lot of these conservationists or architects actually share with me that they are saying a lot of the governments or private developers today, they actually approach them. They already have certain heritage building at hand. They just needed to reuse them. So these architects that share with me, they're actually quite optimistic and about the future. So now it's easier to convince the private developer and the government officials about the importance of heritage conservation and about the financial opportunity, financial potential of these adaptive reuse projects. And at the same time, there are also more and more, to the second part of to your question, there are more and more schools, universities that would offer heritage conservation related programs. So I remember about 10, 20 years ago,
20 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay.
Only Shanghai Tongji University
yeah.
had a program. And it's not even a whole program. I think under architecture degree. So it's a 5-year program. And then the first four years, all students, they would take the same courses. And then only the last year, they will have different streams. So one is architectural design, some is interior design, and one is heritage protection or conservation. Just one.
And their final project, thing like that.
Yeah, just for final year, they would have a different or different focus, I guess.
Yeah.
And then a lot of these students actually, when they graduated from Shanghai Tongji University, they would come to Hong Kong U to study a master program in architectural conservation.
Okay.
But that was about 10, 20 years ago.
Okay.
More recently, I think in the past 5 or 10 years, different universities in China, they also have their own program in architectural conservation. So for example, Tongji University, and also I think the Southeastern University in Nanjing, they are also quite emphasized on this architectural conservation program. So I think it's a change, it's a good change. In direction. So it's being more and more valued and respected. I mean, the conservation profession.
Thank you, Hugo.
How about in Indonesia? Is there a university program specialized in architectural conservation?
We are still struggling to open one, but
Punto is still fighting for it to establish one program in particular. Okay. The last 3 questions coming from YouTube. So the question we have discussed about on how the activity videos now currently are formed based on the control, right? But is there any basic rule? The next question is asking if there's any basic rules in implementing these urban revitalizations that ensures the sustainability of the program and binds the users or the building owners.
Any regulation on the urban revitalization?
I also put it that in the Zoom, Hugo, so you can read it through. But so it's asking if there's any basic rules in implementing these urban revitalizations to ensure the sustainability of the program and that binds the users or the building owners. So the rules that binds the users to sustain the program.
Okay, so for the first question, and yes, it's also related to the destination of the historical and cultural areas that I mentioned to you earlier, that the government designated back in 2005, I think. So again, this project is, when they evaluate this project, it's not just the project itself. Sometimes it would also involve the surrounding area, the building fabric. So it would already subject to high control, development intensity, and also the traffic impact that it will bring about, and subject to the location of this particular project. So again, sometimes the government, if it's a very important cultural and historical significant area, so they will set up a committee so to evaluate the new project, not just the building itself, not just the architectural design, but also its impact that it would possibly cause to the surrounding area as well. So and also Shanghai government, I think about 2 years ago, they also set up, they published a guideline. This is not a regulation, but they also published a guideline for street design, the public space design. So it's not a law or regulation, but at least they have certain guidance. So for street design. So in a way that would also apply these urban revitalization projects.
Okay, I think we have discussed this, but I'll again reiterate the questions. Who is responsible for implementing these urban revitalization projects, and what is the ownership of the existing building? Who owns the ownership? How is the ownership of the existing building?
It depends, but most of the building usually is only leased, especially, for example, the heritage building on the bond. So it's only leased. So the government, the local government or the state-owned enterprise still own the building. So they would lease it to a private developer, usually 30 or less than 50 years lease, I believe. And then for bigger project, I think in China they have the property law. So I think for different uses, I think for residential is 75 years, and then for industrial use is 50 years. That is for new projects. So, and then every so often you have to renew it, or the government would take it back and then they will be developed. But if it's a heritage building, so it will be under protection. So the government always own it, so they will only lease it.
Okay. The last questions. So he is asking, Danny is asking, is there any empowerment approach in this project, like capacity building or community involvement?
In some building, it does. So, for example, in cancer block building, when you get a chance to look at this, the detail of this building, so I actually list out all these social impact and also the implementation or how the project came into being. So actually, there's a lot of local empowerment in this particular project. It's kind of grassroots, and a lot of community organization were formed in the process of it. So Cancer Farm project is a good example if we want to look at empowerment of adaptive reuse, because this is actually bigger and it's actually initiated by community members. So that would be a good case study.
Thank you very much, Hugo. So I think we have to forego the opportunity to look at the slides, although we didn't have time to sneak peek on the, but I will forward to receive your PowerPoint presentation so we can take a closer look on how projects was undertaken. So that's all the questions that we have. Thank you very much, to enrich our knowledge on adaptive reuse. We look forward to your other projects sharing in Yangon or somewhere else, but we need to learn from each other on how we can, because it's a good practice. Thank you very much. Without further ado, I return back to the MC, Mbak Umu.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Devina, for moderating today's heritage talk. I invite Pak Boy Birawa from Indonesian Institute of Architects to deliver the closing remarks. Boy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hugo. How do you do? My name is Boy. I think we never met. And
I look forward to meeting you.
Yes, thank you for the presentation, and congrats with your book. Well, actually, I also a bit discussed with this one. I think I'm just worried that the attendance that in the presentation is not grab so much with your presentation, because the first you talk about the city. Maybe I have to explain that. I have visiting Shanghai, and the time I go with the group for conservation of Jakarta Museum of History, and then we visiting the history of Museum of Shanghai. Then we found that also the content is so much, and your culture is too deep, very deep. It's difficult to compare with our. So it's difficult to practice it on our museum too. And well, as put some things that about the things that about the Shanghai, the river, how important is it, and then also the old city. And what we need actually, if you explain for the city, is the historical background. If we didn't grab it, then yeah, we try to look from the object or adaptive reuse in the buildings, not urban, because urban then have to tell us about what and how and why. So why people gathering in the river? Why there is Nanjang Street, and then also the old town? Why it's there? Then related the modern part. So when I come there, I see that between the modern traditional, there is space that very beautiful that is become commercial now. And also the river itself, the nature, it's always become it's very beautiful, and then get I think it's a very metropolitan city. When you talk with us with the very young culture, then it's the important is to approach how we thinking ourselves and compare with yours, because if we compare, it's difficult. difficult because yeah, it's instead of the story is a very part this then also how the layers of history in the Shanghai actually explaining why the adaptive reuse can be accepted not only for governor but also for people, because in the some part before, yes, sometimes before, of course you all do the trial error is happen, then people then say that yeah, this is good, this is not, and government say also this is can economically better without destroying or the heritage. This moment is starting now in Indonesia, so we still just doing the trial error. We still looking which way is the best. So we cannot compare to other part that have a different historical layer, understanding from government to the people. I think that's important. Maybe I have to say ini to the participant. Saya kira begini. Jadi kalau kita mengcompare dalam posisi yang begitu berbeda, kita susah untuk menangkap sebenarnya. Tadi pertanyaan saya lihat bagaimana cara adaptifnya, ya, bangunan itu beradaptasi, bagaimana suatu urban itu bisa survive untuk menerima dua-duanya. Itu proses sangat panjang. Nah, kalau kita mengcompare apa yang kita pelajari ya dari hal ini sebenarnya hanya bahwa dalam proses learning atau teror ini, maka kita harus mempercepat segala sesuatunya. Ya. Kalau compare bahwa kuliah sudah bisa ada konservasi ya karena pasarnya sudah besar, dan kan layernya di sana ada Prancis, bahkan umumnya sama seperti kita, dia lebih lama ya, beberapa kerajaan, kemudian ada jajahan Prancis, kemudian jajahan Jepang, dan kemudian survive, terus Shanghai sebagai bentuk kota baru yang compare with Beijing, kemudian mereka fight gitu, dan ekonominya booster ya, jadi boosting, jadi banyak hal. Nah, apa yang kita bisa belajar di sini pertama bahwa histori atau sejarah itu tidak bisa diabaikan bahwa dia menentukan dan punya nilai. Tapi sebaiknya usahakan supaya tidak membongkar dulu. Meskipun pemerintah juga masih ragu ya, karena ekonomi itu juga penting. Saya kira itu adalah poin-poin yang kita bisa petik dari sini. That's the learn can pick from your presentation. You know that that's an interesting point. But for us maybe need more explanation and put some a point that we can make, yeah, so easy for us to understand. I think that my closing. Thank you very much.
Should I translate a little bit on the closing remark in bahasa?
Ya, di sini saya kira perlu ada pertemuan di satu titik ya, yang kemungkinan sama ya. Kemudian kita bisa baru bicara ketika ada situasi yang sama. Tapi banyak hal yang sulit karena ya Shanghai, Hong Kong kita kenal itu dari film-film kungfu. Tapi perdagangan di kita tidak sepenuhnya seperti itu. Kita harus mencari titik temunya untuk mendapat pelajaran dari buku ini nanti.
Thank you, Mas. So in essence, so we're learning a lot, especially when we are studying or we are learning from you the layers of historical based on concessions. But the economic booster is also the key drivers to this. I think learning from the trial and error that we have in Indonesia, we cannot really compare on which is good, which is bad. But we just have to keep learning one another. And what we learn from here is that history is very important. History is very important to this, and we cannot go just get the project going without looking or respecting the history of the place and the building itself. Does that a fair summary of what you say?
I think this, sorry, I just get wrongly. I thought the translate to Indonesia. Yeah, it's translate to English. I think that's the point. Yeah.
I think you make a very
so much about culture.
And actually, when I also in my book, when I talk about the history of adaptive reuse in Shanghai, I also mentioned that actually adaptive reuse or conservation in general in Shanghai is kind of like it's an ongoing mutual learning process for not just the architects involved, but also the private developers, the government officials, and also the general public.
Yeah.
Because like you mentioned, actually, a learning process for all of us, not just
Yeah.
the architects and not just the government, and also especially including the general public. In the case of Shanghai, I think in the past 20 years, the general public look at heritage architecture very differently compared to today. In the past, they may not be as open to adaptive reuse. Mostly they were only, okay, if it's important, we just preserve it, we restore it, and we protect it. And back then, the part we used was still quite new and alien to governments or to public. But I think that has been changed. And I hope, not just Shanghai or Hong Kong as well, I think it's been changing in a better direction.
So Hugo, thank you very much. I get two requests. The first one, can you close your PowerPoint so we can all be present in the
Photo.
yes. And then the second question, we have very interesting questions. How can we get the book? Is it available in Amazon, or how do we get to purchase your
It's
book?
available in Hong Kong U Press website. Let me check.
No, okay.
Hong Kong U Press. I think they also deliver international.
Do they receive online orders? That's fine, but I can pass on the information to the requester, but we can also share that in public later on. If you can pass on the information to me, I'll be able to share to the audience. No more requests from me, Hugo, sorry. All right, without further ado, then Umu, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Boy, for the wonderful closing remarks. So we will shortly have a photo session on my cue, so you're welcome to turn on your camera if you're comfortable to. We will wait 30 seconds for everyone to turn on your camera, please. Okay. We have 4 slides here, so I'm gonna cue for 4 times. Okay, for the first slide, 3, 2, 1. For the second slide, 3, 2, 1. Third slide, 3, 2, 1. And the last one, 3, 2, 1. Well, thank you very much, Hugo.
Yes,
Thank
you very much.
for this insightful presentation. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. Also, thank you to all collaborators, and most importantly, thank you to all participants. Thank you for carving out your time out of your busy schedules to join us and learn with us today. So this concludes our discussion, the 55th Obrolan Heritage. Stay safe, stay healthy. We will meet you again for next month Obrolan Heritage. Bye.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Hugo.
Thank you very much,
Thank you, Hugo.
Till next
Thank
time.